In this lesson, we're going to be using a bend deformer to move the lower spine bones. Okay, so let's go ahead and drop in our bend deformer. That's just going to be right here at the top. And it's the first deformer, the bend. And we'll go ahead and drop it under the skeleton right there. And now what we need to do is go ahead and move this into place. Now make sure you're not in your camera view for a moment. And go ahead and grab your move tool, and we'll just kind of start to move this over, just using those axes of the X and Z. And then we'll use the Y to kind of move it up a little bit. Just like that. Okay, let's figure out where the bend is happening from. So if we select that bend and I start to change the strength, you see that this is the end that's moving. Everything else is kind of staying still. So with that in mind, we actually need to rotate this so the bend is going to be at the tip of this instead of on the top of these bones. So I'm going to undo that. We'll grab our rotation tool and just rotate this over about 90 degrees or so. Right in there. Okay. And now let's try that again. So if we select our bend and we start to change the strength, you'll see that now it's bending, but it's bending up and down. And I want it to bend side to side, almost like a snake crawling on the ground. So if I undo that, we need to rotate it 90 degrees going this direction. So grab that y-axis and come in here to about 90 degrees. And now if we come in here and start changing the strength of that bend, you see how now it kind of goes from left to right. But we have a little bit of a problem in that the mode right now is set to limited. We need to change it to within box. So right away that's going to make this change just a little bit. You can see that it's only changing what's within the box at the time that it's moving. But our box is still a little bit large. So let's start to make this a little bit skinnier. We can middle click to go into our top view here, and we can see now this helps to make that a little bit skinnier. Maybe move it over to the right a little bit and possibly even back over this way. And then let's take a look at it in this direction. It's a little bit too tall, so we can come in here and change that height a little bit. It's a little bit harder to know which these numbers represent since we changed the orientation so much, but that's totally okay. We won't have any trouble with that. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now, before we do anything else, we need to go into our coordinates and freeze our transformations. Then we can go back into our object, and it looks like we actually need to freeze our transformations back here when we're on frame 0. So you can just make sure that that's set up that way. And if you're on frame 0, you can also reset your axis or your position scale rotation. So what you would do is just go up to character and go to commands and choose reset PSR. So that's helpful also to make sure it's really clean. Okay, so now what we're going to do is start to animate this kind of swinging look that we want with our tail. So just starting on that first frame with the bend deformer selected and the object tab open, we'll just set a keyframe with it right here as it's straight, just like we have with all the others. So go ahead and set a key, turn on auto key, and we'll scrub forward a little bit. So it looks like if our body moved this way, our tail would have moved to the left. So we can come in here and turn our strength up in the positive a little bit, just like that. And so you can kind of see how that moves. And if you feel like it's stretching it too long in length, you can turn on the keep y-axis length, and you see how now it's just rotating, it's not actually getting longer, which is a little more realistic. Okay, now let's scrub forward a little bit more until he starts to move the other direction. Keep going right about there. And so now he's going to move his tail the other way, like that. So you can see how it'll move over here. And probably at this point, the tail would be pretty far rotated in this direction. So we can add another keyframe and then it'll just stay there. And then right about here, it's definitely going to start to straighten back out. Just like this, moving over. And that's probably a little too sudden, so we can go ahead and maybe pull this one back a little bit. So it's kind of starting to straighten out a little bit sooner. And then looks like it goes over to the right just ever so slightly. So we'll go back into that bend and go the other direction now. Just a few degrees. And then we can make that a little more extreme a few keys later, a few frames later. So you see how it kind of snaps and then gets a little deeper. And then right about here, he's straightened back out again. So we can get that closer to a 0. And then here, we'll go a little bit into this area here, a little bit into the negative. So it'll go the opposite way that he's moving. And then here, we'll go positive again. So this one's a little more subtle. Just kind of scrubbing forward to find some more movement. Okay. Now here we get a big movement. So by this point we want to be rotated pretty far to the left. So that's going to be in the positive rotation. And then we'll let it kind of start to 0 back out. You can just type in a 0. And then by the time it gets over here, we want him to be rotated this other direction now. And then by the end of it, we'll go back to 0. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom back out a little bit. And we can turn off our background for a moment. And let's also go into our filter and turn off the deformer filter. You can also turn off the camera if you don't want to see that up there. And we'll just go ahead and hit play. Let's frame this up a little bit better. Okay. Great, that's looking really good. It really feels like it's moving kind of almost independently of the way that the zombie is moving, which is really, really helpful. Now to make sure that our animation looks good and to double check it, we can turn back on our background, turn back on, look through our camera, and let's go ahead and come in here and we'll turn off everything but the skeleton. So I'm going to turn everything off just by painting through that, and then I'll turn the skeleton back on really quickly. And then we can just scrub through. So that makes sense that his tail would go in the direction of his leg when his hips go the other way. Moves out. Now that looks pretty good because it's coming back in. That makes sense, but I think we could make it start to rotate in again a little bit sooner. There we go. That moves really nicely with him, almost like it's just being carried. Now at this point I think it could be rotated a little bit more close to us. So let's come in here, we'll select our freeform, our bend, and we'll bring this a little bit more in our direction. So that's at about 46 degrees now. There we go. And it goes the other way as his hips kind of go back in that right hand direction. Now here, there's not a lot of movement, but then right about here, we get this big upwards movement. So I think one way that we can help to also kind of reinforce that that's what's happening is to set a key for our angle. So I can control click this angle here, and then we'll go forward to about right in the middle of this, between these two keys. And now you see we can make this kind of go upwards by pulling that up. So that goes to -44. So that kind of pushes him up in the angle. And then about right here, he's almost all the way back down, so then we can just zero that back out. So that adds a little bit more of a different kind of movement to that quick little animation that really helps make it look more real. And then at this point, I think we could also wag this a little bit closer to the camera on this last frame. Okay, so let's watch that through one more time now that we've kind of double checked it and made it look a little bit closer to what he's doing and the way he's moving. It's all very subtle, but it really helps to make it look a little more real. That part especially really moves through with it. Okay, so I think that that's a great place to leave off with that bend deformer. And in our next lesson, I'm going to show you how to use yet another type of deformer, but this one is going to be a jiggle deformer. So because we have all of these kind of slimy looking guts, they're going to jiggle as he moves around and as he moves back and forth. So there's a deformer we can use to help it look a little more realistic. So I'll show you how to add that and how to change its settings to give it a little bit more of that dynamic feel with the motion that we've already added. And we'll do it in the next lesson.